This presentation will cover anti-spam, do not call, and other legislative approaches to annoying marketing practices. When I first dove into the topic, I thought I would approach it broadly and talk about the legislation from an international perspective. Then I realized how much information existed on the topic. Therefore, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on email, telemarketing, and junk fax types of spam and the federal legislation combating them. For a brief overview, we'll go over some definitions, we'll talk about the business impact of spam, federal legislation, reaction to that legislation, we'll test the legislation against some real pieces of spam, we'll talk about what consumers can do to combat spam and what marketers can do to ensure that they're not considered spam. Let's start with the basics. What is spam? Well, shoulder of pork and ham, of course, but that's not the kind of spam I'm going to discuss. I'm talking about non-solicited pornography and marketing. What is not considered spam? As far as email goes, any non-commercial, transactional, or relationship content email that facilitates an already agreed upon transaction or updates a customer about an ongoing transaction and doesn't contain false or misleading routing info is not spam. As far as telemarketing goes, it's not spam when calls or messages placed with your express prior permission or on behalf of a tax-exempt nonprofit organization or from a person or organization with which you have an established business relationship. Faxes are not considered spam when they're sent to recipients with whom the sender has written permission or an existing business relationship, as long as the fax number was provided voluntarily. And voluntarily is pretty loose because voluntarily can mean you merely have your fax number listed on your website. Some of you might be asking, what's the big deal? What's the business impact? Well, in 2012, it was estimated that 68.8% of all email traffic was spam. In 2004, a study was done by Ferris Research Incorporated, and it was estimated that the additional equipment, software, and manpower needed to combat spam would cost California organizations $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion every year over 10 years ago, and it grows every day with the sophistication and number of spammers out in the world. As I mentioned, there's an exorbitant amount of legislation surrounding this issue at state, federal, and national levels. The three major pieces of federal legislation fighting the issue are the CAN-SPAM Act, controlling the assault of non-solicited pornography and marketing act. There are several regulations within the act, but high level, it replaced any existing state anti-spam laws. States are still allowed to enforce the parts of the CAN-SPAM Act that restrict non-wireless spam. To comply with the requirements of this act, email advertisements must have a functioning return email address, an opt-out option, a valid physical postal address of the sender, clear and conspicuous identification that the message is an advertisement or solicitation. There are strict penalties for violations that include both criminal and civil penalties, such as prison for up to 5 years and damages up to $2 million. The TCPA, or Telephone Consumer Protection Act, again of which there are several regulations within the act, but high level, it restricts marketing calls and text messages to cell phones and residential landlines. It specifies several requirements for fax machines, auto dialers, and voice messaging system, and generally prohibits communications using automated systems, artificial callers, and pre-recorded messages. It established the Do Not Call Registry, covers both interstate and intrastate calls, and there again are strict penalties for violations. The Junk Fax Prevention Act, JFPA, requires senders to provide specified notice and contact info on the fax that allows recipients to opt out of faxes. The CAN-SPAM and the TCPA both cover faxes as well, but the JFPA introduced exemptions to existing legislation, giving marketers loopholes. It established an existing business relationship loophole for faxes that did not exist before. What's the reaction to this legislation out in the marketing world? Well, it's mixed. Legitimate marketers are leery because the fines are so hefty and ignorance is not a defense if action is brought against you. For the most part, consumers have been happy with the TCPA's Do Not Call registry and regulation of telemarketers. However, the same cannot be said with the CAN-SPAM Act and the Junk Fax Prevention Act. As I mentioned before, the CAN-SPAM Act replaced state anti-spam regulation as it directly relates to email spam. However, most states have stricter regulations. Let's take a look at one piece of the text from California's regulation. This bans spam altogether. A person or entity may not do any of the following: initiate or advertise an unsolicited commercial email advertisement to a California electronic mail address. Opponents of CAN-SPAM say that the state laws would do a much better job of combating email spam if they could be enforced. They also say that the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, does not do or cannot do an adequate job of enforcing the regulation. So let's test it. We'll take a look at a junk fax and a junk email I recently received, and we'll compare them against the federal regulations to see if they meet the smell test. Here's an email I received. Remember our requirements. To comply, the email advertisement must have a functioning return email address. Check. Clear and conspicuous ID that the message is an advertisement or solicitation. Your scores have just been updated. I'm not sure I buy that that's very clear and conspicuous in telling me it's an advertisement. Next, it needs an opt-out option. I don't see one, but wait, if we scroll to the bottom, we can find one in tiny font. This is also where we can find the next requirement, a valid physical postal address of the sender. I wanted to see just how valid it is, so I Googled it. I'm not really sure this is a place I want to send my social security number to check my credit score. What does that sign say? Tired of cable? Let's take a look at this fax advertisement I was recently sent. First of all, they're supposed to have an existing business relationship with me, which they don't, and written permission to send me a fax, which they don't, and to comply with the TCPA and JFPA needs to be clear and conspicuous that it's an advertisement. I don't think sending me something that looks like a check is very clear and conspicuous. And somewhere in here it needs to say that on the first page of the ad, that the recipient may make a request to the sender not to send any future faxes, and that failure to comply with the request within 30 days is unlawful. I certainly don't see that anywhere. And it needs to give me an opt-out option along with a telephone number, a fax number, and a cost-free mechanism of opting out. In tiny writing, at the very bottom, it says, "No longer interested? Please call to be removed," but it doesn't contain any of the other requirements that it's supposed to have. So it looks like the leniency of the federal regulations have caused loopholes and left too many things up for interpretation, like what does clear and conspicuous mean? It's obvious that rules in a rule book somewhere is not putting an end to spam, so what recourse does a consumer have? Well, know your rights. You can bring a private suit against the violator. Know who to contact to report a violation. There's ways to report a violation online, via phone, and via mail. Also, know how to register your number on the Do Not Call list. What can marketers do to keep themselves out of trouble and ensure they're reaching their audiences? Well, of course, you should know the law, but most importantly, remember what marketers do. They create value for customers and build strong customer relationships in order to capture value from customers in return. If you can do this, you won't need to employ annoying marketing tactics to reach your audience.